So welcome everybody to today's session, the second episode of our series, Sustainability is Better Business. It's my pleasure to introduce you our speaker, Nick Beglinger, a motivated green economy activist at the crossroad of business and politics. He's a member of the official Swiss and Liechtenstein delegations at the COP climate conferences, as well as several high-level government advisory groups. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Cleantech 21, a foundation that accelerates technological and regulatory innovation to address the climate and biodiversity crisis with strategic initiatives. Some of the themes they work on are sustainable development, clean tech, sustainable market economy, and policy and technological innovations. So Nick, thank you so much for joining us and giving us a bit of your time to lecture us. It's yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'll share my screen quickly. Hi. Let me see. That should be it. Okay. Maybe full screen. So I hope everybody is seeing my presentation.
Yes.
It's not yet going to full screen, but it should be. Here we go. Okay. So Andrea, thanks for the introduction. I'll do a very quick overview to everyone what I'm currently doing, where I'm coming from. So I'm running, as Andrea explained, the Cleantech 21 Foundation. I started this foundation at the very end of 2007 after a sort of surprise meeting with then Economic Minister and Federal Councillor Doris Leuthard. I was in Abu Dhabi. And I explained to Mrs. Leuthard as part of the economic delegation that happened to Abu Dhabi that I think competitiveness will be majorly influenced by sustainability in the future. So sustainable development of a company, but of a country as well, will be sort of the new competitiveness. She really liked that approach and explained to me that in Switzerland, she has a problem of everything green when it comes to political support. So she asked me actually quite directly to set up an economic foundation, an economic association, a Verband in German, to basically lobby for those businesses that are pro-sustainability. And that was Swiss Cleantech. So in 2009, I started Switzerland's first Green Business Association. And the theory of change has been quite simple. As Mrs. Leuthard explained, it was difficult to bring sustainability through politics, and therefore we made a new association that put together the voice of all the pro-sustainability businesses, and with that we could win the middle parties and therefore gain majority in parliament, because the middle parties, the CVP, the FDP, the GLP in Switzerland, they listen very much to what business is thinking about a particular political issue, and therefore Swiss Cleantech was there as a new voice for business, different from Economie Suisse, different from Swiss Men, different from the other associations that existed then. And with our new voice, we could start a discussion about, what business really thinks. It wasn't just one opinion anymore, but there were different opinions we could discuss. And that's how Swiss Cleantech has actually been quite successful in energy policy, in emission policies, etc. Swiss Cleantech continues to exist, but in 2016, I spun it off our foundation. It's now an independent organization that continues to good work in policy. I'm no longer involved. I'm together with Bertrand Picard, who was my co-founder. We're now sort of the honorary presidents, not really having anything to say anymore, but every once in a while having a bit of strategic interaction with the current team. So as of 2017, my focus was again on the international side of things. I came from a very international career. I studied I'm originally Swiss. I studied in London at the London School of Economics. I was lucky to win an essay competition at the end of my studies. I started work with McKinsey, first in Germany, then in China. I set up Vietnam's first software joint venture, went to Singapore, started a new company with some friends in the infrastructure area. And through that infrastructure consultancy, I actually met Mrs. Leuthard. We were working at the Abu Dhabi government at the time. That's how Swiss Cleantech came about. And I wanted to go back to international work after a long time being focused very much on Swiss policy. So as of 2017, I started a couple of international projects. The first one is CPX, the Climate Policy Exchange. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The second one is the International Climate Dividend Alliance. This is an alliance to promote a particular form of climate policy that has to do with emission pricing. I'll speak a little bit more about that. And I also run an innovation program called Hack for Climate, which is focused on technological innovation and brings together a few sort of disruptive, cutting-edge innovation to the climate scene, because we think that could be quite relevant. So much for my background. With a little bit of a word of warning, this was on the cover of the Weltwoche 6 or so years ago, after we won a couple of important political battles. There was a lot of criticism in what I was doing. And most importantly, people were saying that I was, the Schaumschläger is like the big mouth of the energy change movement. Now, I'm not particularly proud of this cover, but I just still wanted to present it to you at the beginning, because on the one hand, what we'll be talking about today rests a lot on scientific facts. So I can be quite confident in those, what the present is concerned. But when I look into the future, of course, I don't know exactly what's coming. And to some people, it may sound like, Schaumschlägerei. It may sound like I'm talking sort of in a big mouth way about energy and climate developments. I must say, though, that most of the things that I have said are actually coming about. So renewable energy are going to be the dominant force in the energy markets. Electric vehicles are going to be the dominant form of transportation. So a lot of the things that I actually have said then are coming about today. But, one or two things may sound a bit weird and into the future for you. If you find these issues, note them down, please, and ask me questions later. My aim is just to address what I think is really a crisis issue that needs addressing, and address that issue in a sort of novel way with innovation that is at the crossroads, as Andrea said, at the crossroads of regulatory and technological innovation. Okay, so much for me. So let's sort of top down go a little bit into this climate scene and scenario that we are all facing right now. And I start off with two caricatures that, in my view, symbolize very, very well what has been happening to a large part thus far. So on the left, you see the guys on the oil station high up above sea mentioning that they don't really care if the sea level rises 0.5 meter or a meter. That wouldn't be the end of the world. For them, not. And that's true. But if you look at the small huts on the bottom left of the image, the situation looks very different. And here, this symbolizes a situation that we face very much at the moment in this issue. Rich countries like us, Switzerland, they have caused most of the problems that we're facing now. They are the rich ones. They have emitted a lot of greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels. And the consequences of that, unfortunately, are felt mostly by those who don't actually contribute much to the problem. Those people in lower income countries, in emerging markets, that haven't contributed much but suffer the most because their infrastructure is not yet so great. Their houses are a lot closer to the sea, so if sea level rises, they are affected very directly. The other caricature is also quite significant in my view. So you have this huge wave of trouble coming in the back, and these guys looking very closely at the centimeters of sea level rise that we may or may not have gone through already. I also think it's very much a true symbolic, because it's really very clear the situation that we're facing right now. I mean, the head of the UN calls this code red. NATO is doing studies about the security consequences, etc. So climate change is dead serious, and it's so serious that it's really much more of the big wave in the back than the nifty-gritty details that unfortunately many of us are held up with. So if we put this in a little bit in the context of Switzerland, I'm sure you all know we have voted on a new CO2 law, and I'm a regular jogger and walker, so I pass through many roads in my area, and one of the roads I commented in a LinkedIn post a couple of months back, that caught my eye and reminded me of that caricature. the SVP was against this CO2 law, and it made a billboard ad where I was walking in Helliberg, a very rich county outside of Zurich. And, you know, the ad, I think you can read it, says, you know, driving a car only for rich people. Do we really want that? No, we don't want it. So we say no to the CO2 law. Very much of a sort of developed world problem that, you know, transportation in cars is going to get a little bit more expensive. This is actually in Helliberg, where the houses cost 3, 4, 5 million each. So, you know, very much of a symbolic that the rich world sometimes is held up in the nifty grifties and is not willing to make, you know, concessions that, in my view, we absolutely have to make. The second one here, we were talking about those nifty grifty details and how, you know, where we stand right now. And there, I commented in an NZZ article. NZZ also very frequently sort of not focused enough on the crisis issue that we're really facing in climate and related fields of sustainable development. They were arguing that we actually have grounds to be optimistic that Switzerland and other countries made progress. And it is all true, but those progress indicators are very much of the detail. If we look at the macro situation, we actually haven't made progress, and we haven't made progress to the extent that we have to make progress. So I'd like to, in this speech, tell you a little bit about my thoughts about where we are, what we need to do, and what this could mean for each and every one of us, and for you, of course. So looking at the World Economic Forum indicators of global risks already gives a pretty good indicator as to where we stand. I think most of you know this risk rating. It's done by surveys of you know, decision makers, those people who attend BEF. So it's considered to be a fairly good a survey. And you look at where people see long-term risks, and the differentiation is between the likelihood of a risk, so how likely it is that we see that risk, and then the impact. So if it hits, how bad is it, if you want. And if you look, green is not good. Green is just a category, and the category environment, which green is very much at the top everywhere. So in terms of likelihood, extreme weather, climate action failure, natural disaster, etc., this is all, you know, very, very much what we're talking about in terms of climate crisis, and it's there up in the first 5 ranks of those risks that informed people look as most likely. And also, if we look at the impact, so how severe could be those risks, also there we see climate action failure. So our failure to act now to fight this crisis is also very, very much on top of the impact risk index. And if you actually scroll down all the way to the bottom on that list, you see another risk that we have experienced recently. That's infectious diseases, right? That's corona. So, you know, in there with corona, heavy impact is climate risk, but much, much higher in terms of the risk ranking, which should give you an effect that we're an understanding that we're really facing a huge risk. I mean, an absolutely huge risk that is nothing else but the crisis, and therefore needs urgent addressing. If we look at how urgent this is, and, you know, is Greta right, or is the SVP right, or, you know, where should we as other citizens be in our thinking on this issue? You know, I'd say if in doubt, then listen to what Greta says and not what the SVP says, because the truth is much closer. Maybe not, you know, all the way with Greta, but the truth is much closer to Greta than it is to SVP. That's for sure, in my view. Overall, you see from the past, the left chart, our emissions have continued to rise. They've risen with more energy demand, more fossil fuel burning, increasing population demanding more goods. All of this has led to this exponential increase in emissions. And if we want to address the climate crisis, what we have to do is nothing short from, you know, a total turnaround. So from the peak that we're having right now, we need to go down very steep to hit, by most experts, you know, at the latest, net zero 2050, meaning that our emissions practically have to go to zero by 2050. And if you look at this chart already, you see that's quite an effort. And most science, and I have the privilege of spending a lot of my days reading on this and figuring out how urgent exactly it is and what new stuff is coming about. And if we look at this new stuff, the new science, the pressure is actually always to make it more urgent. There's very, very rarely news coming about, it's not that bad after all, a new study has come out. Unfortunately, most of the new studies say, oh, shoot, we forgot about these emissions, or we didn't think about this effect. So actually, we need to even, speed up further. That's the left side. Now, when it comes to actual action, planning actual actions, where exactly are we going to go down on this curve, and how exactly are we going to do that? Of course, as you see in the different scenarios that the IPCC, which is the main organization collecting all the science on climate, there's a huge variety of paths. And we can't go into the detail today which exactly we should follow, but I'd like to tell you there's a variety. And each and every one of us in our decisions on a daily basis going forward have to make that call on our own, in a sense. So how ambitious we want to be is not clear science. How ambitious we want to be is more of a combination between sort of a moral obligation saying, hey, we're Swiss and we can't just, let the Maldives go on the water because our car driving shouldn't be more expensive. If we have a fossil car, okay, we need to pay a little bit more money because it just can't be that because of our driving, they are flooding. It is also an interpretation of the science, an interpretation not just of the science of emissions, but also the innovation where the technology will help us and what the technology will enable us to do in going down this curve. So the message here, there's different options. Definitely it's going to be sort of a hard ride. And how hard a ride it will be is, as I mentioned, a bit difficult to say, but there's a really good indication that a superb research body made. You see it at the bottom left, CB stands for Carbon Brief. If you don't have much time and if you want to read one good source on climate, I highly recommend Carbon Brief. They have made this excellent analysis, and on purpose I copied it from Greta's Instagram account because I think it's interesting that Greta on Instagram is publishing this and gets almost 2 million of views at that stage already. And what she has highlighted in terms of ways that we could go about addressing this climate now is really interesting. On this first graph, you see that if we would have started our efforts in the year 2000, that means over 10 years ago now, if we would have started then the curve to go down in terms of our emissions would have been quite smooth. You see the yellow line, a smooth decrease. And the smoother the line, the better for everybody, really, because the less trouble, the less changes, the less disruptions we'll see. Unfortunately, we're now in the year 2021. They have made that calculation for 2019, but it's more or less the same. And you see that with each year that we've waited, our emissions have gone up. And that means that our way down has to be even more sort of extreme. Now, the Carbon Brief says that under a high likelihood scenario, this would mean a 15% reduction in emissions every year. That's an incredible figure. That means really dramatic changes need to happen. No more diesel cars can hit the road. They all have to be taken back at one stage. No more oil heating, etc., etc. So there's two lessons here, right? One is the ride's going to be steep. How steep exactly, we don't know, but it's going to be really, really steep. And with every year that we are waiting, the CO2 budget goes up, and that means the remaining budget we have to reach the target that we should reach, the 1.5C maximum warning target, gets more ambitious and is more difficult to reach. And in reaching it, we'll have more disruptions. So we need to start ASAP, because not just, is the problem there, but the earlier we start, the less of a problem, less of a disruptive path we will have going into the future. Now, this is sort of the scary stuff. Now, the less scary stuff is that actually that transition looks scary if you look at the emission reductions that we have to go through. But actually, if you think about what the actual effect will be, often you hear the press exaggerating things. So here you have an analysis. This is by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. So this is not like an NGO, but this is like a large industrial conglomerate. And they show this chart that actually, if we put the right price on emissions to account for the costs that those emissions actually cause, i.e., if we make the right climate action, for example, in cement, that means a 3% cost increase of a standard house using cement. Same thing with steel. You see, if the steel has to pay for all the emissions in the right way, a car is going to, because of that, be 1% more expensive. Chemicals, same story. So the main thing is there is, you know, a steep decline that we have to do, but if we do it smartly and it's a technological way, the effects on the consumer at the end of the day are actually not going to be that great, and I think that should give us hope. Another really interesting study I'd like to highlight in this question of how much should we do, how fast should we do it, is the pure economic analysis. And Andrea introduced me as an activist, and I'm sure you agree by now that I am, you know, by now mostly an activist, but I did start out as an economist, and I still use my economic analyses to draw my activist conclusions. So this is an economic study, and this is quite a good economic study because it's by the University of Yale, and it's been published, peer-reviewed in Nature. That's a pretty high sort of level of quality of this publication. And what does it find? It finds that if we are, it compares the 1.5 degree scenario, which is a steep decline, ambitious decline, to the 2.0 C scenario, which is a bit of a less steep decline. And it asks the question, is it really worth going for fast climate action for the 1.5 C? Is that worth, you know, all the effort? And the answer is very clear. By a factor of 60, it's cheaper for us to invest now in the technologies that are necessary for us to reach 1.5 C, rather than 2.0 C, which leads to costs that are much greater than the investment we would have to back now to stick to 1.5 C. So it means it's very much in the money, climate action. It's not, you know, there are short-term issues for sure. If you have to close a coal-fired power plant, those people will lose a job. But there are many other people making jobs, installing solar panels, you know, maintaining batteries, etc., etc. So it's not, you know, all lost. It's actually economically, it would be a very clear story. We have to go for 1.5 C. We have to go for an ambitious scenario. So in sort of doing an intermediary conclusion on climate strategy, what we really need today, I like to highlight, we need technological innovation, yes, but we need regulatory innovation as well. I'll show you what's coming now, how this could take place and what we are working on actively, but it's not sort of one stakeholder can do it all. It's not just companies that have to address climate change, but it's also government with new regulations. It's not just governments, it's also citizens that need to, make the purchasing decisions of an electric car and no longer a diesel. Make the decision of staying in Switzerland for their vacation and going to their destination with a train and not fly to the Maldives 3 times a year because that causes a lot of emissions. Also, academia is necessary. Thus far, we've got good data from the universities, but we still have a gap between the interpretation of that data and the raw data itself. And I hope for academia to be more outspoken and help us, help decision makers understand what really the data is saying. On the right, I brought 2 current examples of things that make a lot of sense, and I would recommend you reading. One is the new book by Paul Polman. Paul Polman has been the previous CEO of Unilever. Unilever is one of the best companies when it comes to sustainability. And in his new book, which I really recommend, he asks exactly these questions. Whose responsibility is it? What do governments do? What do companies have to do? And his conclusion is the same. All actors are important, and he looks at this issue from a corporate perspective. I recommend you read this book. It's a very good, interesting book on this subject. Another example is a recent LinkedIn post I did on a Sunday newspaper commentary by Katia Centinetta, who's a fairly well-recognized political commentary, because her headline was that it's companies that have the biggest leverage in addressing the climate crisis. And I answered her that it's not that simple, that companies are extremely important, but also government is very important. And if she puts in the title, the highest leverage, who has the best leverage, I actually would argue government right now has the stronger leverage right now, because a couple of regulations have to put in place so that companies can actually do the job later on. What this means, I'm going to go into a little bit further on. So if we think about policy, it is important, and I'd like to give you sort of the background how we are approaching this. If you look at it from a very, very macro type viewpoint, you could say there's two main ways of going about addressing a problem such as the climate crisis. If you're the government, on the one hand, you can say we want to support the good things. So you give a subsidy for electric cars. Everybody gets $3,000 if they buy an electric car, or you say you subsidize the price of photovoltaic power. There's a feed-in tariff, so those who produce power, the government sort of buys that power. You basically make the choice: what is good, what do we need, and then you support that. That's one of the ways of doing it. And the other way, which in our view is the better way, hence the smiley, is you don't focus on what is good. If you're the government, you let the companies do that. You focus on what's bad, because you have less of sort of a transactional problem, if you want, if you focus on the bad. You can rely a lot on the science. We know, emissions are bad. We know what the price on emissions should be. So if you're the government, you can put a price on those emissions with a regulation, and then you change prices, and you let the market choose what that means and which products are the right products given those right prices. The reason, which ones to choose here, the main reason is that, from my experience at least, I think many people would second that, innovation is generally faster than regulation. So you regulate something basic like cost of emissions, and then you let the market do the speedy things of which solar panels, what batteries, what software, etc. That's where innovation can flow much faster in the private market than with the government. So these are sort of the political philosophical question, if you want, to address these issues. If you put that into a sort of a context, a theoretical context, what we are promoting is the sustainable market economy, meaning that we want a market economy. We don't say the government should make the major decisions, but we say that the framework for the market has to be right. So this sustainable market economy works if you internalize those externalities that are currently not priced. And emissions, of course, is a super example of an externality that's not priced. If you have a steel company, if you emit lots of coal-fired power to melt in your smelter installations, then you don't have to, if you're in India, for example, don't have to pay for those emissions, even though you cost them. They're an externality that will cost society as large, but you as the producer, you don't have to pay them. So what government can do is it can set those market rules on the ecological front, but also, of course, on the social front, like a minimum wage, for example. And in terms of actually executing, actually building stuff, running an investment fund, doing things like that, you minimize government involvement. You only on very, very strategic issues like early stage research where the market wouldn't fund, these type of things, that's where you actually actively engage in execution. All the rest, the 95%, you leave to the market because you've set the prices right. Market actors will optimize on a profit basis, and they will come to the right decisions because they include it includes now the prices, and they can make their decisions based on the right prices. And of course, you make those rules such that they're planet compatible, so that the rules accommodate for the fact that we only have one atmosphere and one CO2 budget to control our warming. So this is sort of the philosophical, theoretical part. And now I want to dive into a few of the actual projects that we're doing and give you a bit of a rationale why we're doing this. So I mentioned as the last project was Hack for Climate. And Hack for Climate is this innovation program that basically just wants to bring disruptive technology into the climate policy space. So we've been, the pictures from the first event that we did in Bonn, when there was the climate conference in 2017. We brought together 100 top hackers from over 30 countries, and they were doing a hackathon in Bonn, working specifically on projects that use disruptive technologies and can bring us a lot further very fast in climate. The theory behind the technology that we have is basically the following. In terms of macro drivers, we're going from a centralized analog world in a decentralized digital world, which in general is a very, very good thing. And we can also grow. It doesn't mean we have to shrink or anything, but it's going to change a lot. Main drivers being decentralization and digitization that drive everything. And also in climate. So if you think about energy, we used to have large nuclear and large power plants for coal, for example. More and more we will see distributed solar power installations that together are just as powerful, even more powerful and a lot more resilient than, for example, a centralized plant. Same in mobility, same in many, many other areas. We see this trend to digital and to decentral. If we look at the technologies a little bit more in detail, there's the fourth industrial revolution topic that we've studied quite carefully, that the World Economic Forum is promoting. And out of this fourth industrial revolution bag of different activities and technologies, we pick three out which we think are, for climate and biodiversity, particularly relevant. Those three are IoT, the Internet of Things, DLT, distributed ledgers, or also known as blockchain, being one type of distributed ledger, and then we have artificial intelligence. We don't have time today to go into the detail why these technologies, but very briefly, and there's a white paper for those who are interested that is linked on this slide, but very in very general terms, these three technologies allow us to do basically automated systems. With IoT, we capture data. With distributed ledgers, we can administer them in a very efficient, transparent, open, fair way. And with artificial intelligence, we can learn lessons out of that captured data that is administered in a good way. And these lessons, again, we can feed back to IoT devices. Think of a heat pump, for example, and we tell the heat pump to heat now or to wait until the sun's back up for the next heating cycle. So we also execute. We can also execute based on our AI learnings. And if we sort of put this together, these trust and incentive systems can emerge that can really, really be sort of a groundbreaking. And I give you very briefly two examples. Out of the Hack for Climate 2017, the winner has been a project called Open Surface. Open Surface is basically proposing a completely new way of how we monitor forests. So in the past, if you invest in a sustainable forest, for example, and you need to check whether this forest is still alive and nobody has cut the tree, we used to send a TÜV person from Germany flying to Indonesia, where the forest happens to be, writing a report and sending this report as a PDF to the investors, telling them, yeah, the forest still stands and I've counted the trees, they're about right. In the future, actually now in pilot projects already, we can monitor with better satellite images. You see on the top left, planet.com satellites, which are really, smaller than a shoebox, but extremely powerful in terms of the image quality that they deliver. And they have many of them up there, so they deliver frequent images. And with good images and frequent images, you can start to analyze those images in a completely machine-driven way. So you have machines that read the satellite images, and the machines then can learn if something changes on the images, what that means. So you have alert services that are real-time, whether this forest still stands, and you can start making all types of services to farmers, to investors, etc. In this new way. So we use IoT, such as a satellite or a drone or a mobile phone. We use DLT to make sure everybody can access the data, and there's a veracity test on the data as well. We use AI to do most of the work of analyzing the data, and then we can even automate things like, you know, sending an alert message to a farmer. Hey, you haven't cut your crops, and there's a big storm coming. All the other farmers have cut their crops. Why don't you cut yours as well? This type of services. Quickly go to another project example where, again, this troika of technology has been applied. This has been in Switzerland, actually, a pilot project financed by the Ministry of Energy, which was taking place in Wallenstadt, a small city in the center of Switzerland, where we basically created the first power market, local power market, with the overall intention to show that this distributed energy that can come from the roofs of different residential buildings, the roofs of different company buildings, if it's made in a smart way, if there are IoT, DLT, and AI elements involved, we can actually generate a lot of the power that is needed locally. We can generate that locally as well, and we have a smart way to interact with the grid. So things that we read in the papers right now, like the loss of, or the lack of power in winter, for example, can be addressed with these issues. And this has been a pilot project. There's still a URL, I think, ongoing where you can download the final report, because the project has officially closed, and there are several spin-offs from that project now in the market. Okay, I spoke a little bit about Hack for Climate. I have a few minutes left. I also want to give you a quick highlight on the two other projects. So already I said Swiss Cleantech was the first Green Business Association with Bertrand Piccard and the political message. We flew over Bern, the Bundeshaus, and we basically said that, you know, there are businesses who think climate is serious, and therefore we want government to act. And the reason why this is powerful is because we managed to change the law, for example, the energy law or the climate law, and that brought huge savings in emissions. One of our actions, for example, has led to a tightening of the national target of Switzerland in terms of reducing GHG emissions. So we made that target more difficult to reach, but by doing so, we saved 23 million tons of CO2, the difference between the target that Switzerland wanted to adopt and the target that we managed to push through policy. That gave us a huge savings. So the message, if you change the regulatory framework of an entire country, all the market changes in that country, and your effects on climate are going to be very big. A lot bigger than if you're a company and you make one pilot project, you have your cement plant and you start to use biodiesel instead of normal diesel. You have an effect, but you have a limited effect, even if you're a huge cement company compared to the whole market acting. So the same logic of moving the framework condition is now done by our CPX project, which is basically a way to bring global companies that understood what there is to do in climate to be active politically in the national markets. The chart on the right basically shows you what I said before. If a company takes action itself, it has a small effect. If it includes the supply chain, it has a bigger effect. But if it then includes actually the framework conditions by advocating for better regulations, then it can move the entire market, and the effect is by far the biggest. So CPX is trying to do exactly this. It links global businesses with national policy opportunities. So let's say the WWF Switzerland wants to have the next climate law being voted yes and not no in Switzerland. The WWF can submit their initiative that they plan for Switzerland, and we forward these initiatives to large companies We technologically do it such that the company sees their own targets and then they see the targets of the initiative, so they can very quickly decide, shall we support this or not? If they support it, we collect those voices and give it to the WWF in Switzerland so that the WWF has strong supporters and therefore a better case when they're doing their national policy work. This will work globally. The status right now is that we have two of the best companies on board already. We've got Unilever and IKEA. We're right now concluding with a couple of other companies, hopefully before COP in 10 days, to announce this. It's a very useful project to make national policy work better, in the sense that we bring in the leading global businesses who understand where the ball bounces down to the national market, where usually they're not engaged in politics. The last project I'm going to talk about is the International Climate Income Alliance, because it sort of rounds off between my theoretical start and what we as a foundation do on a project basis. With ICEA, we are promoting a very particular way of pricing emissions, different from, for example, emission trading systems or carbon taxes. We say that the best way to promote emissions, to price emissions, is to put a price on all of them high up in the value chain, and then disperse all the money that you have collected as the government back to the people in equal shares. Now, this is really interesting because when you think about this ad I showed at the beginning by SVP and car driving becoming so expensive that only rich people can drive cars in Switzerland, there is actually a big difference between the emissions of poor people and rich people. You have on the left example of China. You see that very poor people, be it in the country or in the cities, have a much lower emission footprint than rich people. And you see exactly the same in the US. Lower income households, lower footprint, higher income households, higher footprints. Also logical, you have more houses, more cars, you fly more, etc. Now, if you disperse in equal amounts, so if you charge all the emissions as the government and you take it and you send it back in equal amounts, you can create a very good emission pricing instrument, because it is simple, it is fair, and is effective. So it's simple because you price all emissions, very different from what we proposed in Switzerland, for example. You do it in a very good and smart way. You give all the money back. That makes it very fair. The lower income households are not producing so many emissions, but get an equal share of money back, which means actually they get more money than they spent on higher prices. And because you give the money back and you have 100% coverage, you can actually also make a high price on emissions without hurting a low income household. You send the money back, so they're not hurt, and that makes it really effective as a policy as well. And because this point is so important and not many people understand it yet in Switzerland, I added another slide. This is from a University of Zurich study. The link is down there on the slide as well, that show you that if we collect all emissions in Switzerland, and if we disperse that money back to all people living in Switzerland in equal amounts, if we do that to 100%, then 63% of all households, so that's the second red line there, 63% of all households benefit. That means if we would make this law, the people who have to vote, the majority, would actually have a financial benefit. Their diesel increases less in price and their heating oil, etc., than the money they get back regularly. And that, in our view, could make a real difference in terms of climate policy. So right now, we're actually working on this for Switzerland. So in our view, the reasons why the policy was not adopted on the 13th of June was that it was bad timing, yes, but it was also the wrong political approach. It was too complicated. It wasn't efficient. Not all emissions were priced. It wasn't fair. Not all the money was sent back. And then there's also technology missing. So some of the Hack for Climate technology we actually use in these political examples. We send back money electronically. We identify people in an electronic way, which actually it makes the whole thing even better. So you see how this technology and innovation aspect come together. So right now in Switzerland, actually, we think the way forward is to introduce a new package, a political package that includes very few but clear regulations along what I've described, to emphasize that this is a lot to do with fairness and not so much with actually guiding people, but it's fair. Those who emit a lot, they have to pay. Those who emit less, they don't. So that's basically my view on how it should continue in Switzerland. And here's the last slide as the conclusion. So if you want to make a sort of put your head around climate issues going forward, I recommend that as drivers, you think of 1.5C and not 2C as your target. You think of net zero, not only 2050, but probably quite a bit before in our internal calculations. And if I advise companies, I'm at the year 2040. As a person, as a company, as a government, you don't make any new fossil investments anymore. We can't afford this. You think of a CO2 price that is not like it's now in the European market at 60 euros, but you think it more in the $150 area, so a high CO2 price that you need to look at. And you're also ready for other regulations, and you don't block them politically for ideological reasons. You know that maybe a ban is necessary. Some other policies will be necessary. So you should really say yes to those regulations that are needed, as little as possible, but all that are needed. That's basically my message. And so on the global scene, as in the climate conference coming up next week, this is only the general setting and the general targets. It's actually the local market, your voting, your actions, your investments, your purchasing decisions as consumers that really make the difference as to whether we can do it or not. And so with this, I conclude with the big shout out to everyone. I hope you got some facts out of this, but I also hope you got some motivation out of this to really take action now, because we are in a crisis and we all need to take action. Thanks a lot for your attention.